They had dragged her up there like she was nothing more than a misbehaving child, her wrists bound with the coarse rope that scratched her skin raw, her head forced down, not in surrender but in shame, though she had done nothing wrong. Nothing except speak when she was told to stay silent. Nothing except walk tall when they wanted her to shrink. Nothing except exist in a place where girls were expected to be obedient, silent, and invisible. And now the crowd had gathered in the square, buzzing with anticipation like vultures circling carrion, and the wind carried the scent of dust, sweat, and fear as they placed the stool at the center of the makeshift stage, made from old planks and arrogance, and the high matron stepped forward with the ceremonial shears gleaming in her hand like the blade of a guillotine, and the girl, her name was Liana, stood trembling not from fear but from fury, her eyes locked forward, unblinking, defiant. Her long black hair cascading down her back like a river about to be dammed, and the matron raised her voice to the crowd, declaring in that shrill, theatrical tone of hers that Liana had broken sacred rules, that she had written words, in a book not meant for her, ideas not meant for a girl, dreams not meant to be spoken aloud, and for this, for the crime of curiosity, she would be punished, not just for her own lesson but for all the others watching. To remind them what happens when you dare to rise above your station, and the crowd leaned in, thirsty for humiliation, that ancient addiction, and the first lock of Liana's hair fell to the wooden boards with a whisper like a fallen leaf, and then another and another, the rhythm of the scissors matching the rhythm of her heartbeat faster and faster, and though her mouth was shut tight, her eyes screamed, "You will not erase me," and just as the final strands were about to fall, just as the matron reached for the crown of her head to shear off the last of Liana's pride, the doors of the hall burst open with a thunder that silenced the entire square, and a figure stepped through the blinding sunlight. A woman in a red dress, not walking but gliding, tall and composed, every step a verdict, her heels echoing like war drums on stone, and the crowd parted not because they knew who she was, but because something about her presence made them feel small, made them feel judged, made them question for one trembling second if they had made a terrible mistake. And the woman didn't raise her voice, didn't scream or plead, she simply pointed at the girl on the stage and said, "That's my daughter," and everything, the wind, the crowd, the world, froze because the matron knew that voice, knew it like a memory buried under years of fear, because this was not just any woman, this was Seraphine, once a general, once a leader of revolutions, thought dead or vanished, hunted and erased from every archive, every book, every whisper of rebellion, and yet here she was, alive, draped in crimson like blood-turned silk, her eyes the color of dusk before a storm. And when she stepped up onto the stage, she didn't flinch, didn't wait for permission, she took the shears from the matron's stunned hand with the calm of someone reclaiming what was always hers, and she held them up not like a weapon but like evidence. As if to say, "Look what you've become," and she turned to the crowd and spoke, not to beg, not to threaten, but to awaken, and her words were slow and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of forgotten stories and stolen futures, and she said that this public shaming, this theater of obedience, was not order but fear, not tradition but control. And she told them that girls like Liana had always existed, brilliant and brave, but history had a habit of cutting them down before they could bloom, and that if they watched in silence now, they were complicit. And for a moment no one breathed, and then someone in the back lowered their eyes, and another dropped their head in shame, and the silence cracked like thin ice under truth, and Liana, still bound, lifted her chin, tears streaking her cheeks not from sorrow but from recognition. And Seraphine knelt before her, brushing away the shorn hair with a tenderness that made the crowd ache, and she whispered, "I'm sorry it took me this long," and with a flick of her wrist she cut the ropes, and Liana stepped down from that stage not as a symbol, but as a spark, and from that day, everything changed, not all at once but enough for the fire to catch. But freedom is not a clean break. It's a jagged wound that bleeds through generations, and as Seraphine and Liana descended the steps of that wooden platform, the silence behind them cracked open into chaos, some shouting for order, others for change, many simply stunned by the collision of fear and defiance they had just witnessed, and yet neither mother nor daughter looked back, for looking back is for those who doubt, and there was no doubt left in Liana now, not after the blade had kissed her scalp and spared her soul, not after the woman in red rewrote the ending they had prepared for her, not after the crowd saw what unyielding love and unapologetic courage looked like when draped in defiance instead of chains, and they walked through the square like it was theirs, because it was, in a way it had never been before. And as the doors of the Hall of Adjudication slammed behind them, the matron collapsed onto the stool, shears trembling in her lap, face pale with something far deeper than fear. The recognition that power built on silence crumbles when someone dares to speak. And Seraphine, guiding her daughter through the back alleys like a ghost returned to haunt the living, finally let out a breath she'd been holding for 16 years. And in that breath were all the names of the women they had buried beneath rules, all the screams choked into obedience, all the ink blotted out before it could form a word. And Liana looked up at her, hair half-shorn and heart beating like a war drum, and asked the question that had burned in her since she could form thoughts. "Where were you?" And Seraphine did not flinch, for the truth was a bitter root. But she held her daughter's gaze and said, "I was surviving so you could rise." And though Liana did not fully understand, the weight of that truth settled into her bones like armor, and they walked on, deeper into the forgotten veins of the city, where whispers turned into rumors and rumors turned into movement. And as night fell, the fires of rebellion were lit in kitchens and courtyards, in books hidden under floorboards, in lullabies sung in defiance, and in the dreams of every girl who had ever been told to bow. And they found shelter in the home of a woman named Maeve, an old friend of Seraphine's who had kept her name alive in secrets and scars. And it was there that Liana learned to see the world not as a cage but as a map, with escape routes etched into every act of kindness and every refusal to break. And Maeve taught her to fight, not with fists but with stories, not with rage but with vision, and Seraphine taught her the history they tried to burn, and together they built a network of girls who had seen too much and remained quiet for too long. And Liana, now with hair cropped short like a banner of survival, now with voice sharp as the shears that tried to silence her, began to speak not just for herself, but for every girl still watching from the shadows of fear. And soon the square where they once humiliated her became a place of gathering, not for punishment but for truth, where mothers brought daughters and fathers learned to listen. And though the matron tried to reclaim her control with new decrees and louder threats, it was too late. Because the silence had already broken, and the sound of freedom once heard cannot be unheard, and Seraphine became a myth reborn, the woman in red who returned like prophecy, and Liana became the voice of a new generation. Not a leader they chose, but one they needed, and in time her story traveled beyond the city, into provinces where girls wrote her name in chalk on brick walls, into prisons where women whispered her tale to keep their spirits alive, and even into the archives where her arrest record had once been stored, now replaced by a plaque that read, "She was never the problem, you were just afraid of her power." And still the work was not done, for power does not yield quietly, and every inch gained was met with pushback, with slander, with violence masked as concern. But Liana had already learned the lesson they never meant to teach her, that when they cut your hair on stage to shame you, it only grows back stronger, wilder, and no blade can cut the roots of who you are. And years later, when a new girl was dragged to that same platform for a different reason, speaking her native language in a school that forbade it, Liana was already there, not just watching but standing beside her, older now, steadier, her red dress fluttering like a flag in the breeze. And when the shears were raised once more, a hand caught them midair and a voice echoed across the square. Not Seraphine's, not Liana's, but the girl's mother, trembling but unbroken, who said, "That's my daughter." And in that moment the cycle cracked again, not from rage but from memory, from the truth that once freed cannot be buried again. And the girl stepped off the platform, uncut, unharmed, and the crowd, older now remembering, did not cheer but they nodded, and the matron, retired and forgotten in a house too big for one, watched from a dusty window, wondering if this was what justice looked like. Not a storm but a tide, slow and unstoppable, washing away everything built on silence. And Liana, now the woman in red, held the girl's hand and whispered, "You don't need to be brave for them. You just need to be brave for you." And as they walked through the square together, no one dared stop them, and in every home that night stories were told, not of fear but of fire and freedom, and daughters who would never be silenced again. And so the years folded into themselves like pages in a book no one dared finish writing, and Liana, once the girl whose hair was severed on stage, grew into a force neither the matrons nor the fearful could control, her story weaving through every corner of the land like wildfire, igniting hidden hopes and awakening slumbering rebellions. And though the scars on her scalp faded, the memory of that cruel lesson was etched into the marrow of her bones, a reminder and a weapon both, and she never stopped speaking, never stopped walking the streets where children whispered her name in wonder and defiance, and mothers clutched their daughters close, seeing in Liana the future they had been denied, and fathers who had once stood silent now lowered their eyes in recognition and shame, learning at last what true courage meant. And Seraphine, ever the shadow behind the spotlight, guided the movement with a quiet fierceness that had once toppled kingdoms, and together they created sanctuaries where knowledge flowed free and books burned no longer but bloomed, where girls learned the power of words and the strength in solidarity, and they whispered of a time when no shears would dare to cut a woman's hair on stage for daring to dream. And yet the fight never eased, for power clings to fear like ivy to stone, and with every victory came backlash, new laws that twisted justice into chains, new faces that wielded cruelty in subtler forms, and still Liana faced them all, her voice rising like a bell ringing through courts and classrooms, through villages and cities, through prisons and palaces, until her name became legend, a promise whispered in the dark by those who refused to be broken, and she carried that legacy not as a burden but as a banner. And when the time came, she walked back onto that very stage where they had tried to make her disappear, this time not bound but crowned with the wild crown of her short hair, eyes blazing with all the stories she had inherited and all the futures she dreamed of, and the crowd, once hungry for spectacle, now hushed in awe, because they knew that here stood not a victim but a victor, a living monument to the truth that cutting hair on a stage cannot sever the roots of a fierce heart. And as she spoke, her words spilled like a river breaking through a dam, flooding ears and minds with hope and rebellion and love that could not be silenced. And somewhere in the crowd, a little girl clutched her mother's hand, eyes wide with the spark of 1,000 possibilities, and Liana saw herself in that gaze, saw the reflection of every girl who would never again bow to fear. And when the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of fire and blood, she stepped down from the stage and into the arms of her mother, the woman in red whose fierce love had torn down walls and built bridges all at once. And together they walked forward, shadows and light intertwined, forever reminding a world that tried to erase them that they had not only survived, they had rewritten the story.